This was humanity's very first mega arena, standing almost 2 football fields long and almost as tall as the Statue of Liberty. The Colosseum, Roman Empire's greatest architectural achievement. But more than a stadium, it was a psychological device capable of controlling the emotions of 50,000 people all at once, with a hidden mechanism that could summon wild animals from darkness and grow forests out of nowhere, and even flood itself to reenact naval battles. For that time, it almost felt supernatural. In his book Confessions, St. Augustine tells the story of Alypius, a man who swore he'd never watched the games. But when his friends dragged him in and the crowd erupted, this morally righteous man became suddenly intoxicated with the joy of blood and began shouting with the crowd. The Colosseum. It could turn blood into a spectacle and distract a restless population. But most importantly, it solved Rome's biggest political problem: how to control 1 million angry, hangry, unemployed citizens. Because roughly 25 to 40% of the male population didn't have steady jobs and lived mostly on food stamps. But that's besides the point. Because 2,000 years ago, the Romans engineered something to shape their identity and legacy long after the empire itself disappeared. And it's the reason why so many of us still think about the Roman Empire today, exactly how they want it to be remembered. To understand how Rome stayed powerful for centuries and why it eventually collapsed, we need to understand their greatest mind control machine ever created. But before the Colosseum, there was a lake, a private oasis in the dead center of Rome. And before the lake was a dense working class district. But after the Great Fire of 64 CE, that area was claimed by the Emperor Nero, where he built Domus Aurea, the Golden House. A little tone deaf. In fact, very soon after, a rebellion broke out across the empire, and Nero was declared a public enemy by the Senate, forcing him to flee the city, and later, he ended up taking his own life. But the lake was still there, standing as a symbol of Rome's tyranny. Before the new emperor, Vespasian, that was an opportunity. He drained the lake and replaced it with something that could never belong to one man ever again. A public arena for 50,000 people. And it was built in less than a decade. But for those 10 years of construction, the Colosseum was sending a message. See, the whole thing was funded by the spoils from the Judean War, and it was built by the prisoners. So they made a display of turning their enemies into their workforce, and in a way, it was a warning. You resist Rome, you might just end up building it. When Vespasian's son, Titus, opened the arena in 80 CE, the celebration lasted 100 days. Wild beasts, flooded battles, gladiators fighting to their death, and free entrances for every Roman citizen. And it worked! The Colosseum did an amazing job of rebooting the image of the empire. And this origin story captures the essence of this mega arena. An architectural marvel about to become one of the most effective propaganda machines Rome's ever built. Let's imagine ourselves as a regular Roman man in the 1st century. Not a senator, not a merchant, not a soldier returning from a glorious campaign. Just an average citizen, a pleb. Based on historical data, you're most likely poor, unemployed, living in a cramped apartment block that could burn down any day. Your day normally starts before sunrise because the building gets unbearably hot thanks to the paper-thin walls. You sleep in a tiny room with your 4 kids and a wife who, well, let's not get started here. Most days, you're looking for work. Hauling stones, sweeping the streets, you'll even clean out the toilets for a couple coins. Cause you're not getting your grain rations till next week. But today, it's different. Today, the games are on. You walk past the markets, the temples, the pigsty, and then you see it. The Colosseum. The largest structure you've ever seen in your life. As you get closer, you're swept in the flow of thousands of other Romans, all funneling towards the gates. You pour in through the vomitoria, moving up the ramps and stairs until you find your level. Suddenly, you're standing, shoulder to shoulder, Because to sit would be soft, very un-Roman. Like those idiots below you. Those filthy rich merchants and those pampered senators, sitting on their cushioned marble seating, sweating through their silk. At least you're not sitting up there with the slaves and the women. Because despite being cramped, from here, the view is perfect. The Emperor's entrance, it gets you every single time. He seems to kind of materialize out of nothing, like a god. The Emperor takes, and the Emperor gives. Hours later, when you leave the arena through the same stone passages, the world feels all right. And you feel lucky. Lucky to be a Roman. But this, well, let's call it what it is. It's an indoctrination process. All of this started way before the games even started. The Colosseum sits right here, at the intersection of palaces and crowded working class districts, and the sacred areas near the Forum. In fact, the entire flow of the city was deliberately redirected so that thousands of people of all classes would be forced to pass the arena on a daily basis. It also sits in a natural bowl between three hills, so you always approach it from above. So the building unfolds until, upon arrival, it fills your entire vision. Of course, it was built directly on top of the private lake of Nero, the tyrant emperor, so the Colosseum essentially replaced the old center of power and reframed the emperor with generosity instead of fear. And before you even step inside, the urban planning had already done half the work. You're already primed to feel awe, gratitude, and loyalty. When you finally reach the building, 80 gates wrap around the whole thing, pulling people of all classes in from every direction. In a way, it feels very democratic. But don't get fooled, because the hierarchy is embedded directly into the architecture. 2 out of 4 entrances are for the emperor and the elites, and the classes sit in their own distinct tiers. Even the facade expresses a distinct order. So there's 3 different types of Greek orders, and each order expresses a different idea of beauty. Doric is strong and disciplined, Ionic is graceful and balanced, and Corinthian is ornate and beauty pushed to its most elaborate form. Think of it kind of like a vocabulary that expresses the personality of a building. So when you're in the temple of the goddess of Athena, for example, you will see Ionic columns. And when you go to the temple of Zeus, you will see Corinthian columns to emphasize his grandeur and divinity, although he was a bit of a creep. But what the Romans started doing is they stacked them in rising levels of refinement, turning it into a language of hierarchy. The base is sturdy and plain, the middle is more elegant, and the top is rich and ornate, creating an architectural metaphor for Roman social order. Strength at the bottom, administration in the middle, and imperial authority at the top. You actually see this a lot in Roman architecture. Other civilizations also had social hierarchy, but the Romans were unusually performative about it. They had it written into the law who could marry who, and who could sit where, and who could even wear the color purple. Because hierarchy was celebrated as proof of Rome's greatness. They believed that their entire success, military, political, and spiritual, depended on order. So while you're absorbed into the games, the Colosseum is quietly reinforcing your place in the system that makes all of this possible. But the thing about the Colosseum that makes you forget all of your problems in all your life might have something to do with the shape of the building. Because what you'll notice is that the Colosseum is not a perfect circle. It's an ellipse. Most temples were in the form of a circle, which is the perfect harmony and balance to serve the gods. So maybe the ellipse was to express that it was a building made for the crowds, to serve the human drama. But the other reason could be a bit more practical. An ellipse has 2 focal points, so it creates this natural narrative path. The gladiator enters, the crowd reacts, the emperor decides, and they are carried off. It also pulls the eye constantly between 2 centers, and this very subtle distortion creates tension. There were historical precedents of oval stadiums, like Pompey's arena, but these earlier arenas were simple open-air bowls. The Colosseum was the very first to enclose the entire amphitheater inside a monumental, multi-story architectural shell. It turned the public spectacle into a controlled, engineered environment. They even created awnings to shade the sunlight and create a cooler atmosphere, enclosing it from the outside even more. So with the entertainment running all day, sometimes for multiple days, it focused all of your attention to the center. But the thing that really sets the Colosseum apart, what transformed simple entertainment into something that felt like magic, is this hidden mechanism. Beneath the sand was a two-level substructure called the Hypogeum. It was added roughly 10 years after the Colosseum's original construction, and it became this backstage area for the games, operated by hundreds of men working in unison. It was linked to surrounding buildings through underground passageways, so gladiators and animals could enter without being seen. There were more than 80 mechanical lifts that could be moved up and down through a pulley system attached to rotating capstans. The lifts would carry props and animals and even fighters, and once it reached the floor, it would snap open automatically, releasing them into the arena. Every single detail was carefully designed to make scenes magically appear out of the darkness, creating transformations that felt almost supernatural. All of this makes you realize that in the end, the Colosseum is just the visible part of a massive, invisible system made of labor, water, grain, logistics, and hierarchy. And it's the system that makes Rome Rome. But it does make you wonder, what would happen if you applied the system, but somewhere else? You can explore this question in Anno 117, Pax Romana, by today's very fitting sponsor, Ubisoft. Here, you play a Roman governor at the golden age of the Roman Empire, aka the Pax Romana, and your job is to take an empty province with a different terrain and landmass and turn it into a functioning Roman city, using the same Roman logic. And to build an arena like the Colosseum, you need to first build an interconnected system of labor and resources, and even reorganize the city long before you can even lay the first stone. One of the wildest features of the Colosseum was the ability to flood it for recreating naval battles. But this was only possible because Rome had engineered one of the most advanced water systems in history that stretched for tens of kilometers and crossed mountains and valleys before entering the city. Here's a crazy stat. The ancient Romans received almost 150% more water per person than most modern cities today. And what's more crazy is these millions of gallons of water were transported using only gravity. So you do need to understand the topography and plan the routes very carefully. So to do this, you first need to do this. If you're interested in this kind of urban planning and historical world building, Anno 117 Pax Romana is on sale for PC until January 5th. I'll leave the link in the description. Apparently, men think about the Roman Empire a lot, according to the hashtag Roman Empire TikTok trend. But why is the Roman Empire, after 2,000 years, still such a hot topic? It's actually kind of interesting when you think about it, because the British Empire, or the Mongol Empire, or the Russian Empire were much larger in scale, but none of them live rent-free in our heads the way Rome does. Was it Gladiator? Gladiator 2? The culture? The engineering? Or is it just men wanting to be macho? I mean, they're not getting dressed up as the slaves. I don't know the reason, but what is true is that no other civilization has been revived and repurposed again and again through cinema, pop culture, across countless cultural periods. And what's more interesting is that the way we think about Rome today is probably exactly how they want to be remembered. Because we think of the conquests, the emperors, and the gladiators. But in reality, most of the Roman population was poor and unemployed. This is a map by Pomponius Mela, the Roman emperor's most famous cartographer. And it shows exactly how the Romans saw the world, with Rome at the center. Because by the 1st century, the capital city of Rome had over 1 million people, the largest city on Earth at the time. But most of them were actually living in dense, unsafe apartment blocks that could burn down any minute. Plus, they relied almost entirely on external grain shipments to feed the entire population, but that was very precarious. They could be delayed because of storms or bad harvests, and even piracy was not uncommon. And when this happened, riots erupted almost immediately. The Emperor Claudius was almost lynched when one of the grain shipments were delayed. The emperors figured this out pretty early on. The real danger is a hangry population. So they started a subsidized grain program, which eventually became a free monthly grain allowance, the Annona, which roughly fed 200 male citizens paid for by the empire. And the Colosseum was actually a part of the same strategy. Keep the population fed and entertained to keep the streets quiet. But the system that held Rome together, and the thing that made Romans feel Roman, also became the very thing that pushed it to its breaking point. Alright, let's look at a slightly more conventional map. This is a map of the Roman Empire in its glory days, the peak of the Pax Romana, when Rome controlled territories across 3 different continents, all stitched together by a network of roads that funneled resources straight into the capital. You know that phrase, every road leads to Rome? It wasn't a metaphor, it's a logistics model. But the Roman model only works under one condition: constant expansion. Most of what made Romans feel Roman, the games, the grain, the legions, the massive public works, wasn't paid for by the taxes from Roman citizens. It was funded by war spoils and newly conquered provinces. Expansion was the revenue model. And that's the part of the story we don't usually hear. The moment Rome stopped growing, the system began to crack. Without the new conquests, there weren't any new giant injections of cash. But the army still expected payment. The grain still had to arrive, so the emperors became kind of desperate. But what's more interesting is the worse things got, the bigger the games became. Commodus staged massive hunts during a fiscal crisis while personally jumping into the arena himself. Caracalla spent so much on festivals that he had to devalue the currency and execute rich Romans just to keep the show going. And it feels almost nihilistic. Like they knew the ship was sinking, but instead of patching the holes, they just set off new fireworks. It's like something in the arena was pulling them in. Something invisible to everyone except them. And that's what actually makes me wonder. Okay, the Colosseum was an incredibly effective tool for controlling the masses, but maybe the real power was controlling the man who controlled the masses, the one person the entire empire depends on. Imagine 50,000 people all watching you, waiting for your hand to move, waiting to feel whatever you feel they should feel. With a single gesture, you can change the entire mood of the arena. And that kind of power, I think, would change the person wielding it. And once you felt it, how do you forget that? How do you not chase it again? Especially when everything is falling apart. Marcus Aurelius was an emperor who hated the games. He would sit in the Colosseum with a book, barely looking up, while the crowd scream around him, because he found them barbaric and pointless. He believed the games were just a distraction from the real problems tearing up the empire. So he cut back on the games, and he tried to spend that money on civic matters and actually trying to solve the problems in the empire. But the people hated him for that. They accused him for being cold, stingy, un-Roman, and an emperor who failed to delight them in a way that an emperor is supposed to. A philosopher who didn't deserve to be the ruler. The ironic part is, right after his reign, he was succeeded by his son, Commodus, who lived for the games. Because the Roman system can't be broken. It's built on the knowledge that people respond more to drama than to policy. But I think we have our own version of the Colosseum. It's invisible, but it can still turn fear into entertainment, anger into engagement, and politics into a performance. We'll trade almost anything to feel something. So the question isn't whether spectacle is dangerous, it's whether we can recognize the moment it starts thinking for us. So what do you guys think? How often do you think about the Roman Empire? Let me know in the comments. And with that, I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.